I was recently looking at two screens side by side. On the left, a live stream of the U.S. Congress, shouting, finger-pointing, and a countdown clock ticking toward a debt ceiling default that everyone knew was just partisan theater. On the right, a quiet, almost sterile press conference from a provincial capital in China. No drama, just a series of technical charts detailing the final closure of a massive local debt resolution plan.
Pretty stark contrast.
It really was. To the casual observer, the screen on the right looked boring, just another bureaucratic ledger-cleaning exercise.
Right.
But if you look closer at the faces of the analysts in the room, there wasn't the panic you'd expect when a bubble finally bursts.
Right.
Instead, there was a weirdly calm, almost clinical sense of release. One investor I spoke with described it as fiscal surgery. He said, in the West, we wait for the heart to stop and then try to shock it back to life. Here, they're performing a multi-organ transplant while the patient is still walking.
That's a powerful analogy.
For years, the global narrative has been that China's debt would be its undoing, that the end of the land finance era would trigger a systemic collapse. We've all seen the viral clips of ghost cities and stalled construction sites used as ironclad proof of an imminent economic heart attack.
The Big Bang that never happened.
Exactly. But while the world was waiting for that Big Bang, something much more calculated and arguably more intimidating was happening behind the scenes. As the 15th five-year plan takes shape, it's becoming clear that this wasn't just about paying off bills. It was a civilizational pivot. The state isn't just cleaning up old debt, it's consciously killing off financial parasitism to refocus on something the West has largely forgotten: physical output and social granularity. That instantaneous shift from a debt-fueled real estate frenzy to a cold, technocratic focus on collective survival leaves most observers stunned.
They're looking for the wrong signals.
They're looking for a crash, but they're actually witnessing a soft landing executed at a continental scale. It raises a question that few are prepared to answer. What happens to the global order when one side stops playing for the next election and starts planning for the next 30 years?
That is precisely the question we're exploring today.
Yep.
Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this great governance divide.
Yeah.
We are looking squarely at the widening gap between two fundamentally different governing philosophies. One that prioritizes immediate stability, rapid execution, and long-term strategic coherence, a high level of state capacity.
Right.
And the other that finds itself increasingly mired in procedural delays, legal challenges, and short-term electoral cycles, what we're calling the Vitocracy model.
And we are using the lens of the 15th five-year plan, covering 2026 through 2030, to analyze this shift. This isn't just a bureaucratic checklist. It embodies a holistic strategy of internal consolidation and technological self-reliance, purposefully designed for a decade, defined by, well, global volatility and strategic competition.
The immediate takeaway is pretty clear, I think. The most significant strategic advantage today is the sheer capacity to execute large-scale financial and industrial adjustments with speed and precision.
Just the ability to do things?
Exactly. If a state cannot act decisively when faced with systemic risk, it cedes ground. And that decisiveness, well, it's quickly becoming the key currency of geopolitical resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately by diving into the financial side of that decisiveness. It's the story of fiscal surgery versus systemic paralysis. The shock of this decisiveness, the ability to act swiftly and centrally, is what truly defines the contrast in these governance systems.
It's stark. When we look at China's approach to resolving its...
So tell us more about the mechanics of this fiscal surgery. China's local government financing vehicles, the LGFVs, had amassed trillions in debt, often hidden off balance sheet, funding this massive urban expansion and real estate boom. How do you surgically stabilize a system that large without triggering panic?
The mechanism was a top-down mandate for what they called systemic financial risk quarantine. The core goal was maintaining systemic survival over the claims of individual, often frankly reckless, creditors.
Okay.
This was executed primarily through two steps: audit and exchange. First, all that hidden high-interest LGFV debt was identified, quantified, and effectively quarantined.
So you find the poison first.
You find it and you isolate it. Second, the mechanism mandated a controlled debt swap. This meant replacing those chaotic, high-interest private and shadow banking loans with long-dated, low-interest government bonds, often bonds issued by provincial governments, backed by central authority guarantees.
So instead of a sudden collapse or a wave of bankruptcies, which would send shockwaves through the entire banking system,
they performed a comprehensive liability exchange, a clean swap.
what was the immediate macroeconomic effect of operating at this scale and speed?
It demonstrated profound state resilience. I mean, by swapping high-cost debt for low-cost debt, they immediately reduced the carrying costs for local governments.
Which frees up cash?
It frees up enormous resources for actual governance and investment rather than just servicing debt. And crucially, the central government financed this intervention not primarily through external borrowing, which would have triggered global debt panic, but largely through internal mechanisms.
Like what?
Utilizing state-owned bank balance sheets and targeted bond issuance, all very carefully calibrated to manage domestic liquidity without triggering excessive inflation. The aim was to stop the systemic bleeding before the heart stopped.
We can ground this concept in a specific human experience. The story of a Mr. Zhang. He was a middle-aged municipal debt manager in a major city like Tianjin, living right in the middle of this chaos.
Exactly. For years, Mr. Zhang's reality was just defined by constant, frantic phone calls.
I can imagine.
Creditors demanding payment, developers looking for extensions, local party officials trying to juggle all these hidden liabilities. His office felt like the financial equivalent of a triage center, running perpetually on fumes, trying to keep the chaotic urban expansion era afloat. He was navigating gridlock every single day, knowing the system was basically insolvent.
And then the central directive arrived.
And it was almost instantaneous relative to the scale of the problem. It wasn't a policy paper or a proposal for debate. It was an enforced implementation of the debt swap mechanism.
So this is what we're doing now.
Yes. High-interest chaos was replaced with the predictable low-interest structure of government bonds overnight.
That structural change must have caused a tremendous psychological shift for him.
Yeah.
What was his immediate reaction?
Mr. Zhang described the feeling not as some economic victory, but as a profound physical sense of being able to breathe again. The state machinery made a decision to stop the bleeding before the systemic shock could fully materialize. This top-down mandate essentially bypassed the years of political, legal, and financial gridlock that would normally accompany a restructuring of this magnitude in any other system.
That instantaneous relief from Mr. Zhang brings us to the core contrast, the Vitocracy counterexample. You mentioned how, in the West, similar fiscal crises often descend into systemic paralysis.
They absolutely do. Vitocracy, as political scientist Francis Fukuyama defined it, is a dysfunctional system where no single entity can acquire enough power to make cohesive, timely decisions.
So when fiscal crises hit Western economies, especially at the municipal level, what happens?
Well, interest groups, whether they are public sector unions, powerful corporate creditors, or just political factions, block progress through endless lawsuits and legislative gridlock. This often culminates in municipal bankruptcy, which is a brutally messy process, as we saw in historical examples like Detroit or Birmingham.
But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Isn't this gridlock, this Vitocracy, just the intended result of a robust constitutional democracy? The veto points, the checks and balances, are there to prevent the tyranny of the majority and protect minority rights. Isn't the delay just the price you pay for accountability and representation?
That is the philosophical defense, and it absolutely holds weight. These veto points are purposeful. They include not just the executive veto, but, committee chairs, the Senate filibuster, the courts, and highly effective lobbying operations. The system is designed to decentralize power and favor the status quo.
Right.
But the argument is that in times of accelerating global competition and systemic risk, the cost of that institutional inertia becomes existential. The system struggles to say yes to necessary long-term infrastructure, and it struggles to say no quickly enough to reckless financial behavior.
So the difference isn't just about speed, it's about the outcome. It's the difference between a controlled demolition, the surgical approach where the system manages the destruction of bad assets to save the core structure,
and a house collapsing on everyone inside, which is the unpredictable, often devastating result of financial and political gridlock.
Exactly.
This highlights a fundamental distinction in state capacity. Capacity is not measured by the size of the national GDP or the volume of currency in circulation. It's measured by the tangible stability, the effective public safety, and the functioning physical infrastructure it can actually underwrite and deliver.
So the capacity to act swiftly to neutralize that systemic risk and inject targeted liquidity, that is what defines institutional resilience now.
It is, as one source put it, the entry ticket to the 2030s.
That makes perfect sense. The financial cleanup provides the necessary stable foundation. But this action wasn't just about paying off bills. It was enabling a massive structural shift, a civilizational pivot, moving away from debt-fueled speculation toward physical output.
That brings us directly to our second major theme. The debt cleanup was simply the prerequisite for the fundamental shift in China's economic growth logic under the 15th five-year plan.
The old model had run its course.
It had definitively reached its limits. The whole model, driven by massive investment in land sales, it was over. Local fiscal revenues could no longer rely on land sales because the debt overhang was too large and the real estate market had matured.
So the state essentially performed a painful yet necessary excision of financial parasitism. They are consciously killing off the speculative excess to refocus the entire economic organism on generating physical output, moving toward the real economy.
It is a radical strategic commitment. The entire national development strategy is pivoting away from high-leverage financialization and toward fortified physical output and highly formalized administrative authority.
And this seems to address that fear of getting old before getting rich, ensuring the industrial base and productive capacity remain intact, even if it means sacrificing some short-term growth numbers.
That's the trade-off they're willing to make.
And this refines the core mission. The rise of what are being called livelihood industries. We are talking about recasting public welfare and service consumption, healthcare, education, elderly care, not as expenses, but as essential infrastructure investments.
That's the crucial framing. These areas are now demanding highly technocratic resource allocation, completely insulated from market whims or speculative bubbles. For example, addressing the rapidly aging population through integrated elderly care facilities isn't just a social service, it's a necessary industrial sector receiving state-guided investment.
And that includes real estate itself, but in a new form. It's re-entering the agenda, but not as a speculative engine. It's now seen as a managed stabilizer, focusing on affordability, expanding rental markets, and massive urban renewal.
Urban renewal is key because it replaces the old debt model with a new structural driver of growth. Much of the residential and commercial building stock in first- and second-tier cities dates back to the massive building boom of the 1980s and 90s.
So there's a huge amount of work to do.
A huge amount. Renewing that aging stock, making it greener, safer, and aligned with modern needs provides billions in necessary non-speculative physical investment for the next decade.
This sounds like the economic theory is intertwined with social stability, the concept you called social granularity. That term is fascinating, but a little abstract. What exactly is social granularity in practice?
Social granularity refers to the fine-grained network of communal stability and individual dignity that the state views as the substrate of collective survival.
The micro level.
It's the micro-level resilience of society. It means ensuring that even the most vulnerable or lowest-income citizens have a predictable baseline of housing, healthcare, and employment security.
So the idea is that welfare is not a drag on productivity, but rather an investment that prevents the social disintegration that comes from deindustrialization and economic precarity. If you guarantee the welfare baseline, the social instability ultimately costs the state less than the welfare payments themselves.
Exactly. Social stability is a prerequisite for long-term productivity and industrial efficiency. By managing granularity, the state preempts localized crises, social unrest, rising crime, loss of trust. That could derail the macro-level strategic goals of the five-year plan.
It provides the psychological security necessary for the workforce to commit to the long haul.
It does.
We can see this transition embodied by the architect Lane. She spent a decade designing the symbols of the old era, the luxury high-rises and prestige projects driven by the land finance gold rush.
Her personal pivot under the 15th five-year plan is incredibly telling. Her firm's new mandate involved repurposing an unfinished, debt-laden residential complex. It was sitting there, a monument to the bubble, and they had to convert it into a livelihood hub.
Describe what that conversion entails. What did they change physically?
Well, they gutted the speculative luxury out of it. The marble lobbies and the open-concept penthouses intended for wealthy, out-of-town investors were completely redesigned for function.
For real people.
For real needs. They were converted into integrated facilities for elderly care, complete with medical equipment access, specialized accessibility features, and critically high-tech vocational training centers integrated into the same complex.
The actual physical work changed completely. She went from designing spaces to sell paper wealth to designing spaces that facilitate tangible human services.
Lynn spoke about the difference in her design philosophy. She said the speculative gold rush work was fast and glamorous, but ultimately shallow. The new work feels heavier. Heavier, more grounded in the physical reality of a rapidly aging society and the need for new skills training. It's a direct, measurable shift from maximizing paper wealth, the inflated numbers on a property deed, to maximizing physical output, focused on meeting specific long-term societal needs.
This conscious shift away from speculative freedom toward a guarantee, if managed, public welfare baseline is what allows them to focus on innovation-driven growth, which is the stated goal of the 15th FYP. It brings us directly to the concept of policy endurance, the governance premium of long-cycle planning.
The endurance provided by the 5-year plan framework is arguably the single greatest competitive advantage in today's turbulent global environment because it inherently rejects short-termism.
It's a binding national directive.
Right. It ensures major multi-year objectives are pursued with consistent focus, regardless of personnel changes at the top.
Contrast that with the Western political cycle. Policies are often shackled to 4-year terms, and as the sources note, they lurch with each election cycle. This creates tremendous policy uncertainty, which is poison for large-scale generational projects.
This capacity for long-cycle governance enables what you could call a 30-year intergenerational relay. They can initiate a complex infrastructure project in 2010 knowing the budget, the political will, and the bureaucratic structure will be there to see it through to completion in 2040. This is how they achieved urbanization and industrialization at an unprecedented scale.
To make this tangible, let's look at the story of Lao Wei, the logistics coordinator working on massive infrastructure projects in the rugged western interior of the country.
Lao Wei is a perfect example of this policy endurance. He is part of the team completing a massive rail and energy corridor project, linking the resource-rich interior to the major manufacturing hubs. And what's striking is that this project was initially planned 2 decades ago.
2 decades of consistent focus, delivering a physical project regardless of whether the national GDP growth rate was 10% or 4%.
Exactly. Even during the extreme global economic volatility of the 2020s, the high interest rate environment, the geopolitical tensions, rising trade restrictions, Lao Wei's budget for that rail corridor remained untouched.
Why?
The reason: it wasn't classified as a discretionary electoral line item subject to annual political negotiation. It was classified under the heading of energy sovereignty.
That security classification locks the project in, essentially making it immune to political defunding.
It does, and the effect of this continuity on the ground, according to Lao Wei, is a powerful sense of public trust and security. He knows that the plan is bigger than the person currently in charge.
So you can commit your life to building a dam or a rail line, secure it in the knowledge that the state will see it through, because the strategic goal transcends the immediate political noise.
Yeah, that's the feeling.
And this stands in stark contrast to the effects of Vitocracy on Western infrastructure, which often gets stalled in political and procedural quicksand.
The comparison is painful. In the U.S., the system's design leads to gridlock, preventing the sustained effort required for mega projects. We see this in construction costs. Construction costs per road and track mile are often multiples of other advanced countries.
And a large part of that cost is procedural delay, which you identified earlier. Can you break down how this procedural delay functions as a choke point?
We need to look at specific regulations like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and CEQAA in California, the California Environmental Quality Act. These acts, originally intended to protect the environment, have morphed into powerful tools for legislative and legal stalling. They require endless environmental impact reviews and allow interest groups, activists, and even competing businesses to endlessly file lawsuits and procedural challenges.
So the system creates a massive number of veto points that are easily accessible to anyone with a grievance, regardless of the merit of the overall project.
Precisely. It allows projects to be perpetually stalled, preventing the sustained effort required to move major infrastructure projects forward. The political system often struggles to move a Brit from point A to point B efficiently, not due to lack of money, but due to institutional paralysis.
It seems like that lack of physical execution, the inability to build things efficiently, is the real deficit in state capacity. But let's shift back to the governance model. This long-cycle planning also links to a change in how political legitimacy is derived. It's moving from performance legitimacy, based on growth rates, to formalized legality.
This is a critical nuance that is often misunderstood in the West. For decades, the legitimacy of the government was tied to delivering phenomenal GDP growth. With growth slowing, the sources point to a pivot toward a highly formalized version of legality.
So if it's not the Western rule of law, which implies legal constraints on government power. What exactly is this formalized legality?
It is the shift toward a highly technocratic and predictable implementation of written rules across the state apparatus. The law becomes an instrument of the party, not its master, but that instrument is used with professional reliability.
Can you give us tangible examples of how this predictability benefits the business environment daily?
Sure. It comes down to bureaucratic efficiency. For a business, this means standardized, efficient bureaucratic permits for building a factory or starting a service. It means reliable contract enforcement. Well, not necessarily faster access to justice, but a system where written, state-sanctioned contracts are enforced predictably. You may not like the law, but you know what the law is, and you know it will be applied consistently by the government bureaucrat you deal with.
The functional predictability reinforces central authority. The population and business environment observe state actors reliably acting in accordance with written, formalized law in their everyday lives.
Yes, the legitimacy is derived from functional predictability and professional reliability. The government demonstrates that it is organized, professional, and reliable in its enforcement. This structured reliability is seen as a higher form of competence than sporadic, chaotic actions, and it reinforces the central authority's ability to execute its long-term strategic plans.
With the financial system stabilized and the governance framework locked into long-cycle planning and formalized execution, they can now focus that vast capacity on the future, advanced manufacturing and strategic control, which is the heart of the 15th five-year plan.
This is where the term New Quality Productive Forces, or NQPF, comes in. This is the strategic concept guiding this phase. It's a complete mandate to shift focus from mere scale expansion, just making lots of cheap stuff, to high-value creation, technology security, and efficiency.
The sources confirm that GDP growth targets are being de-emphasized. The new binding constraints are security, quality, and green development.
We see this resource allocation already in the energy data. High-tech and equipment manufacturing electricity consumption rose nearly 6% in 2025 alone. That is a deliberate steering of industrial resources, land, energy, credit away from low-value, high-leverage projects and toward advanced manufacturing.
This shift is manifesting across three simultaneous layers of industrial restructuring. Let's break down each layer, starting with traditional industries. They aren't being shut down, right? They are the industrial chassis.
Correct. Traditional industries like steel, cement, and petrochemicals must be re-engineered to serve higher value-added segments. For instance, the petrochemical sector is being forced to adopt advanced technologies like CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization and storage, and leveraging green hydrogen.
Why the focus there? What's the end goal?
The goal is to move up the value chain toward things like electronic chemicals, which are crucial high-purity inputs for semiconductors and advanced displays. The projected market opportunity just from technological upgrades in this traditional sector is estimated at a staggering RMB 10 trillion.
Wow.
It's about converting raw scale into high-tech precision inputs.
Next, we have the emerging industries. This is where the state drives integrated ecosystems, shifting away from isolated boutique breakthroughs.
This is where demand defines the supply. We see this in the new energy sector and the burgeoning low-altitude economy. A perfect illustration is the mass production of eVTOL aircraft, electric vertical takeoff, and landing vehicles.
eVTOLs, basically passenger drones or flying taxis.
Yeah.
How does that drive an ecosystem?
Well, when you commit to mass production of vehicles like eVTOLs, you create enormous guaranteed downstream demand. That demand accelerates the upstream clustering of specialized inputs, lightweight composite materials, high-precision sensors, advanced battery systems, and customized software.
So these large-scale chain leader firms pull the whole supply chain along with them.
Exactly, guaranteeing supply chain agglomeration in specific regions like the Yangtze River Delta.
And finally, the future industries. The strategic deployment in areas like quantum technology, biomanufacturing, nuclear fusion, and brain-computer interfaces.
This is pure strategic foresight. It follows a logic of technological breakthroughs plus scenario-driven applications. They are funding long-term strategic R&D, providing the necessary resources for trial and error to build long-term competitiveness in fields that will define the next century of global power.
And this deployment is framed as a long-term national security imperative, driven by sustained external technological containment and export controls.
It is.
So the central thesis is institutionalizing breakthroughs in key areas like AI, advanced manufacturing, and quantum computing. Financial resources are channeled specifically to support this, moving away from high-leverage property development and toward tech-focused and green finance.
And that strategic push is powered by a massive financial buffer. The sheer scale of China's goods trade surplus, which has exceeded $1.076 trillion. This record liquidity is not passive, it's being weaponized as a pressure valve and a strategic funding source.
That's a staggering phrase.
Yeah.
Weaponizing the trade surplus. How is this liquidity used to fund domestic industrial shifts while simultaneously managing the liquidation of global competitors?
It acts as a deflationary export mechanism. Beijing uses this surplus liquidity to fund its industrial champions, effectively subsidizing their global market entry costs. This is what the sources call exporting deflation.
So by flooding the global market with high-quality, state-subsidized goods, often at margins Western manufacturers cannot possibly match,
They force a global price floor collapse.
and Western manufacturers, burdened by higher interest rates, legacy labor costs, and reliance on private debt, simply cannot survive that price environment.
It's a mechanical liquidation process. The surplus funds allow Chinese firms to operate at thin margins domestically and aggressively target the destruction of legacy manufacturing capacity abroad. This ensures that when the global economy stabilizes, Chinese firms are the only ones left standing, having captured market share and control over the entire supply chain.
This brings us to another fascinating strategy. Transitioning from the world's factory to the world's choke point controller, using administrative scarcity to assert global supply chain leverage.
This shift is about moving from high-volume output to controlling high-value inputs. We see this expressed through specific hard mandates, such as the January 1st, 2026 silver export mandate.
Tell us more about the silver mandate. Silver seems like a mundane commodity, yet it's incredibly critical.
High-purity refined silver is a non-negotiable input for advanced high-tech applications, AI server components, 5G infrastructure, and critically, high-efficiency solar cells. The mandate restricts the export of this critical material to only 44 state-authorized firms.
So it's a licensing regime.
It effectively places a licensing regime and a strategic tax on Western innovation.
If you are an American or European firm relying on these critical materials for your next-generation product roadmap, you are now operating under a Chinese administrative mandate.
And China has massive leverage here. They hold 65 to 70% of the global refined silver market and over 80% of tungsten. This provides a clear veto power over global high-tech supply chains.
And the effect is already visible.
It is. The Shanghai silver market has consistently traded at a premium over the London market since the mandate was proposed, effectively creating an input tax for Western competitors who failed to secure non-Chinese supply chains.
Here's where the Darwinian filtering mechanism is crucial. The concept of involution, or Nihuan. This is the state-sanctioned hyper-competition you mentioned earlier. How does this domestic brutality translate into global industrial dominance?
The state permits and even encourages brutal domestic price wars. Firms must compete to the death over razor-thin margins. This process triggers rapid consolidation and creates what are termed apex predator exporters.
And these are the firms hardened by operating at sub-zero margins in the domestic market.
Exactly. For 24 months, they've been in a street fight for survival.
They are ruthlessly efficient because they survived a hyper-competitive domestic environment where only the best integrated and cheapest producers can last.
And when these apex predators hit global shores, they aren't seeking fair market competition, they're seeking the total liquidation of legacy competitors. They are the only ones granted the new coveted export permits, ensuring only the most efficient, state-aligned giants represent the Chinese brand abroad.
This ensures that the global market is immediately presented with firms whose cost structures are fundamentally incompatible with Western industrial cost bases.
That's the idea.
The most visible victim of this mechanical Darwinism seems to be the global automotive and battery sector.
Absolutely. The aggressive vertical integration in the EV sector is a prime example. Chinese firms own the entire value chain, from lithium mines to battery chemistry to refined metals, all the way through to final assembly.
And this vertical integration, supported by state credit and the deflationary export strategy, is enabling a projected entry EV MSRP, the standard price point of what?
$10,500 by 2026.
$10,500. That aggressive pricing rapidly renders Western gigafactories, built with older cost assumptions and higher interest rates, into what analysts are calling zombie assets.
They are financially underwater before they even produce their first vehicle.
It seems like that's the point.
That is the goal of the strategy. Their financial source is surplus-funded state equity, which provides an insulating resilience against global interest rate spikes that continue to burden competitors reliant on private debt. This is state capacity applied to a global industrial strategy, leveraging financial control and strategic inputs to ensure their domestic champions gain insurmountable advantage abroad.
That tremendous focus on centralized, efficient execution, the ability to act quickly and predictably across the continental scale, requires a robust, adaptable administrative structure. This brings us back to institutional resilience, specifically how the state accelerated its administrative control during the COVID-19 pandemic.
The COVID-19 pandemic served as a massive, if unexpected, catalyst for state building. The need for granular, immediate control over population movement and testing required pushing governmental authority far lower than the traditional administrative district level. This involved expanding the capacity of sub-districts and neighborhood committees, the JUE.
Before the pandemic, the JUEs were primarily volunteer groups focused on local mediation and neighborhood events, right?
Yeah.
How did their role change so drastically?
They suddenly became the frontline, quasi-official enforcers of public health law and administrative mandates. We have concrete data that illustrates the magnitude of this power transfer.
Okay.
In some major cities, district-level governments delegated up to 2/3 of their administrative and law enforcement authorities, roughly 270 out of 400 total, down to the sub-districts and neighborhood committees for enforcement.
That is a staggering transfer of operational power. It creates an administrative infrastructure capable of fast response and hyper-local execution, essentially bringing the central government's reach down to the level of the apartment building.
And this is the critical point. The administrative infrastructure is durable. While the specific pandemic measures, the lockdowns and movement restrictions, were temporary and have since been dismantled, the institutional material used to enforce them remains.
It's still there.
The expansion of local governmental authority and the capacity to coordinate rapid collective action is now baked into the system.
So, the central government has gained permanent, fast response control capacity at the grassroots level. This infrastructure is now repurposed for general urban management, social stability, and the efficient enforcement of the formalized laws we discussed earlier.
It provides the capacity to translate central command into predictable human action at the most granular level of society. The state achieved a fundamental capacity upgrade under the guise of an emergency response, reinforcing central authority through highly efficient, predictable execution that reaches every street corner.
So if we synthesize everything we've discussed, the financial decisiveness, the pivot to physical output, the long cycle planning, the weaponization of the trade surplus, and this administrative capacity upgrade, what is the ultimate test of statehood today?
The sources present a very stark dichotomy. On one side, you have systems struggling with what's called civilizational regression, often mired in political paralysis. The freedom offered by democratic systems is often described as the freedom from mediocrity to hinder excellence, leading to institutional inertia.
And on the other side, capacity is rooted in an obsession with physical output, social granularity, and a strategic sense of responsibility for collective survival, executing multi-decade plans regardless of the global noise.
The core finding is that success in the turbulent 2020s belongs to states that can precisely allocate resources and guarantee a baseline of public welfare, executing major initiatives with speed and reliability. This is the difference between planning for the next election and planning for the next 30 years.
So the capacity to translate strategic intent into physical reality is the defining metric of global power.
It really is.
The shift is not merely economic, but a fundamental change in the national development strategy. It is moving away from debt-fueled financialization toward fortified physical output, technological sovereignty, and formalized administrative authority that ensures maximum operational predictability.
The strategic asymmetry is clear. One side demonstrates predictable resilience through long cycle planning and the capacity to enforce rapid continental scale transitions.
The defining metric of modern statehood is shifting dramatically toward demonstrated practical capacity. The future is being won by those who have perfected the infrastructure, both physical and administrative, required to move the necessary brick from point A to point B rapidly and reliably.